Russia just discovered something they were never supposed to see. A fleet of A-10 Warthogs appeared at a location that officially doesn't exist on any military map. And what happened next has Moscow scrambling to figure out what NATO is really planning. The A-10 Thunderbolt, better known as the Warthog, is one of the most feared aircraft in the American arsenal. This tank killer has been around since the Cold War, and everyone thought its days were numbered. The Air Force has been trying to retire it for years, but instead of being sent to the boneyard, these beasts just showed up at a NATO airbase that's so classified, most military analysts didn't even know it was operational. And Russia is not happy about it. Here's the thing. For the past 2 years, Russia has been carefully watching NATO's movements along the eastern flank. They've got satellites, they've got spies, they've got intelligence networks that track every major military deployment across Europe. They know when a tank battalion moves from Germany to Poland. They know when F-35s rotate through the Baltics. They've got this down to a science, but somehow nobody in Moscow saw this coming. A week ago, commercial satellite imagery picked up something unusual at an airfield in northeastern Romania, near the border with Moldova. At first, analysts thought it was just another routine deployment. Maybe some cargo planes bringing in supplies. Maybe a few helicopters for a training exercise. Nothing out of the ordinary. But then the images got clearer, and what they showed made everyone take a second look. Parked on the tarmac were at least 12 A-10 Warthogs. Not F-16, not F-35s, not the newer, stealthier aircraft you'd expect at a forward operating base near Russian-controlled territory. No, these were A-10s. The same planes that turned Iraqi tanks into scrap metal during Desert Storm. The same aircraft that provided close air support in Afghanistan for 20 years. The flying gun platform that everyone loves but the Air Force keeps trying to get rid of. And they were sitting at Campi Terzi Air Base. Now, if you've never heard of Campi Terzi, don't feel bad. Most people haven't. It's not one of those big NATO installations that gets talked about in the news. It's not Ramstein in Germany or Aviano in Italy. This place keeps a low profile, real low. In fact, until recently, the Romanian government barely acknowledged its role in NATO operations. But here's what makes this base so interesting. It's less than 400 miles from Crimea, it's less than 300 miles from Odessa, and it's positioned perfectly to support operations across the entire Black Sea region. If you wanted to set up a forward operating location for aircraft that specialize in destroying armored vehicles and fortified positions, you couldn't pick a better spot. So why are A-10s there, and why now? The official story from NATO is pretty bland. They're calling it a routine training deployment, just some allied cooperation. Nothing to worry about. Move along. But nobody's buying that explanation. Not the Russians, and definitely not military analysts who've been watching NATO's chess moves in Eastern Europe. Because here's what doesn't add up. The A-10 is not a training aircraft. You don't fly these planes across the Atlantic and position them a stone's throw from contested territory just to practice touch and goes. These are combat aircraft with a very specific mission profile. They're designed to fly low, move slow, and absolutely demolish anything on the ground that needs destroying. Tanks, armored personnel carriers, bunkers, artillery positions. If it's on the ground and it's a threat, the A-10 can turn it into a smoking crater. And right now, there's only one major conflict zone where that kind of capability would be useful. Ukraine. Now, before anyone jumps to conclusions, let me be clear. There's no evidence that these A-10s have flown combat missions into Ukrainian airspace. None. And the Pentagon has been very careful to maintain that line. American pilots are not engaging Russian forces directly. That's been the policy since day one of the conflict, and crossing that line would escalate things in ways nobody wants to think about. But that doesn't mean these aircraft are just sitting there doing nothing. Military experts have been pointing out something interesting about the timing of this deployment. It happened right after Ukraine received a new batch of advanced air defense systems from Western allies. Systems that can create protective bubbles over specific areas, making it much harder for Russian aircraft to operate. And if you can push Russian air power back far enough, suddenly the skies become a lot safer for aircraft that need to fly low and slow. Aircraft like the A-10. There's also another factor that nobody's talking about publicly, but everyone's thinking about. Russia has been moving more and more of its ground forces and armored units into defensive positions across occupied Ukrainian territory. They're digging in, building fortifications, creating layered defensive lines that would be incredibly difficult for Ukrainian ground forces to break through without massive casualties. Breaking through those kinds of defenses requires either a huge number of troops willing to take heavy losses, or you need air power that can systematically take apart those fortified positions piece by piece. And that's exactly what the A-10 was built to do. So even if these Warthogs never cross into Ukrainian airspace, their presence at Campi Terzi sends a very clear message. NATO has the capability to provide Ukraine with the kind of close air support that could change the math on the battlefield. The question isn't whether they can do it, the question is whether they will. And that uncertainty is exactly what has Moscow worried. So let's talk about why the A-10 is such a big deal in this situation. Because if you don't understand what this aircraft can do, you might think Russia is overreacting. They're not. The A-10 Thunderbolt is basically a flying gun with wings attached. At the heart of this aircraft is the GAU-8 Avenger, a 7-barrel rotary cannon that fires 30mm rounds at a rate of almost 4,000 rounds per minute. When this thing opens up, it sounds like a deep, guttural roar that you can hear for miles. Troops on the ground call it the sound of freedom. Enemy forces call it something else entirely. Each round from this cannon is the size of a beer bottle, and they're made from depleted uranium. These aren't just bullets. They're kinetic penetrators designed to punch through tank armor like it's made of cardboard. A single burst from the GAU-8 can disable or destroy a main battle tank. A couple of seconds of sustained fire can take out an entire armored column. But the gun is just the beginning. The A-10 can carry up to 16,000 pounds of ordnance on 11 hardpoints across its wings and fuselage. Maverick missiles for precision, strikes against armored vehicles. Laser-guided bombs for bunkers and fortified positions. Cluster munitions for taking out groups of targets spread across an area. Rockets for suppressing enemy positions. This aircraft is a flying weapons platform that can adapt to pretty much any ground support mission you throw at it. And here's the thing that makes the A-10 different from every other attack aircraft in the American inventory. It was designed to take a beating and keep flying. The cockpit sits in a titanium bathtub that can withstand hits from 23mm cannon rounds. The fuel tanks are self-sealing, the hydraulic systems are redundant, and the aircraft can fly with one engine, one tail, half of one wing, and major sections of the fuselage missing. There are documented cases of A-10s coming back from combat missions with hundreds of bullet holes, massive chunks of the airframe blown away, and they still landed safely. You can't say that about an F-16 or an F-35. Those are incredible aircraft, but they're built for speed and stealth and high-altitude operations. They're not designed to get down in the dirt and trade punches with ground-based air defenses while providing close air support to troops under fire. The A-10 is. And that's exactly why Russia doesn't want these planes anywhere near the conflict zone. Think about it from Moscow's perspective. For the past 2.5 years, Russian ground forces have had a significant advantage in terms of artillery and armored firepower. Ukrainian forces have been fighting back hard, and they've had success using drones and guerrilla tactics. But they've been limited in their ability to conduct large-scale offensive operations against dug-in Russian positions. Now imagine what changes if those Ukrainian forces suddenly have access to the kind of close air support that can systematically destroy Russian tanks, artillery positions, and fortifications. The entire dynamic of the conflict shifts. Russian military bloggers and state media started sounding the alarm as soon as the satellite images of Camp Tursi went public. They're calling it a provocation. They're saying NATO is preparing for direct intervention. Some of the more extreme voices are talking about this being a red line that could lead to a wider conflict. Is that overblown? Probably. But the concern isn't completely crazy either. Because here's what makes this situation so delicate. The A-10 is an offensive weapon. It's not designed for air defense or reconnaissance or any kind of passive role. Its entire purpose is to attack ground targets in support of friendly forces. So when you position a squadron of these aircraft within striking distance of a battlefield, the message you're sending is pretty clear. You're putting capability in place. Whether you actually use that capability is a separate question, but the option is now on the table. And that changes the calculations that military planners in Moscow have to make. Let's also talk about the base itself for a minute, because Camp Tursi is more than just a random airfield in Romania. This facility has been quietly upgraded over the past 5 years as part of NATO's efforts to strengthen its eastern flank. The runways have been extended and reinforced. New hangars have been built. Fuel storage capacity has been increased. The air defense systems protecting the base have been modernized. On paper, it's still a Romanian Air Force installation. In reality, it's become a key node in NATO's infrastructure for projecting power into the Black Sea region. And here's the interesting part. Because the base is officially Romanian, NATO can use it without triggering the same political sensitivities that come with basing large numbers of American forces in countries like Poland or the Baltic states. Russia complains about NATO expansion all the time, but there's not much they can do about a sovereign country upgrading its own military facilities on its own territory. It's a legal gray area that NATO has been exploiting pretty effectively. The deployment of A-10s to Camp Tursi also fits into a larger pattern pattern that's been developing over the past year. NATO has been quietly moving more and more capabilities closer to the Ukrainian border. Not in a flashy, headline-grabbing way, but in a steady, methodical buildup that's been flying under the radar of most mainstream news coverage. Patriot missile batteries in Poland, HIMARS systems in Romania, F-35s rotating through the Baltics, naval assets in the Black Sea, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance aircraft flying orbits along the border 24 hours a day. All of it officially for defense and deterrence. All of it conveniently positioned to support Ukraine if the political decision is ever made to escalate Western involvement. And now A-10s in Romania. Each individual deployment can be explained away as routine, training exercises, alliance cooperation, regional security. But when you step back and look at the whole picture, a pattern emerges. NATO is building the infrastructure and positioning the assets that would be needed if the mission suddenly shifted from supporting Ukraine with weapons and intelligence to providing direct military assistance. Are they going to take that step? Probably not. The risks are enormous, and no NATO country wants to find itself in a direct shooting war with Russia. But the fact that the capability is there, ready to go if needed, is itself a form of deterrence. It tells Moscow that if they escalate too far, if they cross certain lines, NATO has options, painful options. And that's a message the Russians are hearing loud and clear. So what happened next that really got Moscow's attention? 3 days after the satellite images went public, something interesting showed up in flight tracking data. Multiple USairForce tanker aircraft were spotted flying orbits over Romania. Not just one or two, 6 of them, all at the same time. Now, tanker aircraft aren't exciting. They don't drop bombs or fire missiles. They just fly around pumping fuel into other aircraft. But their presence tells you something important. If you've got that many tankers in the air at once, it means you're supporting a large-scale flight operation. Military spotters on the ground near Campiatursi reported heavy flight activity. Multiple A-10s taking off in pairs and trios, not just doing laps around the local area, but heading east, toward the Ukrainian border. The flights lasted for hours, and when those A-10s came back, they came back light, meaning they'd expended their ordnance. NATO immediately released a statement saying this was a pre-planned training exercise. They were dropping practice munitions on a range in eastern Romania. Nothing to do with Ukraine, just routine stuff. But here's where things get interesting. Independent journalists and open-source intelligence analysts started digging into the flight patterns and comparing them with other data sources. And what they found raised eyebrows. The areas where these A-10s were supposedly conducting training exercises line up almost perfectly with the terrain and target profiles they would encounter if they were actually supporting operations across the border. The flight profiles match close air support missions, not training runs, and the timing coincided with a major Ukrainian push against Russian positions in the Zaporizhzhia region. Coincidence? Maybe, but a lot of people aren't so sure. What really sent shockwaves through Russian military channels was when one of their own surveillance drones captured footage that leaked online. The video was grainy and taken from a distance, but it appeared to show an A-10 engaging ground targets that looked an awful lot like Russian equipment. Moscow went ballistic. State media ran segments accusing NATO of direct intervention. Military officials demanded explanations. The whole thing became a major diplomatic incident. The Pentagon denied everything. They said the footage was either fake or misidentified. They doubled down on the story that all A-10 operations were happening on the Romanian side of the border and were purely for training purposes. And you know what? They might be telling the truth. Video footage can be fake. Flight tracking data can be misinterpreted. In the fog of war and the chaos of information warfare, it's hard to know what's real and what's not. But here's what matters. True or not, the perception is out there. Russia now believes that NATO might be providing direct air support to Ukrainian forces, and they can't prove it either way. That uncertainty is driving them crazy. Because if it's true, if American pilots are actually engaging Russian targets, that's a massive escalation. And if it's not true, then NATO has successfully created enough ambiguity that Russia has to plan for the possibility anyway. Either way, Moscow has a problem, and the A-10s are still sitting there at Campiatursi, ready to go at a moment's notice. So where does this leave us? The deployment of A-10 Warthogs to a NATO airbase within striking distance of the Ukrainian conflict represents a significant shift in the military calculus of this war. Whether these aircraft are actually flying combat missions or not, their presence sends a clear message. NATO has the capability to provide Ukraine with devastating close air support if the political decision is made to do so. For Russia, this is a nightmare scenario. Their ground forces are already struggling against Ukrainian resistance, Western-supplied artillery, and long-range strike capabilities. Adding American close air support to the mix would make their defensive positions extremely vulnerable. The A-10 is specifically designed to destroy exactly the kind of fortified, armored defenses that that Russia has been building across occupied territory. The timing of this deployment is also significant. It comes at a moment when the conflict appears to be settling into a stalemate, with both sides digging in for what could be a long, grinding war of attrition. By positioning these assets now, NATO is creating options for future escalation if needed, while also providing a form of deterrence against Russian aggression. From a strategic perspective, Camp Tursai represents exactly the kind of forward operating location that military planners dream about. It's close enough to the battlefield to be tactically relevant, but far enough to maintain plausible deniability about direct involvement. It's on NATO territory, which means Russia can't strike it without triggering Article 5 and bringing the entire alliance into the war. And it's been quietly upgraded to support sustained combat operations if the mission ever shifts in that direction. The question now is what happens next. Does this deployment remain a symbolic show of force, or does it become something more? Are these A-10s really just there for training, or are they already playing a more active role than anyone is publicly acknowledging? We might not get clear answers to those questions anytime soon. Modern warfare is fought as much with information and perception as it is with bullets and bombs. Creating ambiguity, keeping adversaries off balance, maintaining multiple options without committing to any single course of action. That's how conflicts are managed in the 21st century. But one thing is certain, Russia is watching that airbase very closely. And every time one of those A-10s fires up its engines and takes to the sky, planners in Moscow are trying to figure out where it's going and what it's doing, because they know what that aircraft is capable of. And they know that if those Warthogs ever do cross the border in force, the battlefield is going to look very different very quickly. If you want to see what happens next with this situation, make sure you're subscribed.